The ballroom glowed like a palace of light. Crystal chandeliers cascaded golden fire across the polished marble floor, their prisms scattering color into 1,000 fractured rainbows. Every corner of the Everett estate radiated wealth, not the loud kind of wealth that shouts in gold-plated ornaments or gaudy displays, but the curated, timeless kind. Here, every tapestry told a story, every painting carried a legacy, and every guest was carefully selected to reinforce the image of power that John Everett had spent decades constructing. The Everett Foundation Gala was not just another social gathering. It was the event of the season. Senators, CEOs, ambassadors, and heirs of old families all gathered in their finest attire, drawn like moths to the flame of Everett's influence. Journalists had often written that if you wanted to see the future of policy or business in America, you needed only to glance at the guest list of his gala. Deals were whispered here long before they were ever signed. Alliances were made here long before they were announced, and sometimes enemies were born here long before the public ever noticed the shift. John Everett himself stood at the heart of the storm, perfectly composed. He was a tall man in his early 60s, silver hair combed neatly back, eyes sharp and unreadable behind the calm mask of a practiced host. His tailored black tuxedo fit him like armor, crisp and immaculate, and his polished shoes clicked softly against the floor as he moved between clusters of power brokers, greeting each with a smile that was warm yet measured. Everyone wanted a word with Everett. Some wanted funding for their ventures, some wanted access to his network, some wanted to flatter him into future favors. He gave each their moment, nodding here, chuckling there. But his mind remained several steps ahead, watching not just words but gestures, not just promises but intentions. It was said John Everett could size up a man in 10 seconds and know whether he would keep or break a deal. Amid this glittering display of influence, however, there existed another world entirely, the quiet, unseen world of the staff. Dozens of maids and waiters moved like shadows across the room, refilling champagne flutes, clearing empty plates, replacing candles when they burned too low. They wore uniforms designed to blend into the background. Crisp white shirts, black vests, black trousers or skirts. Their smiles were polite but restrained, their presence essential but unacknowledged. Among them was Amina. She was 24, though the weight in her eyes suggested she had lived more years than that. Her uniform was neat, her dark hair tied back in a low bun, her steps measured to avoid drawing attention. In her hands she carried a tray of crystal glasses filled with champagne that glittered like liquid gold. She moved carefully, weaving between silk gowns and tailored suits, ensuring not a drop spilled. To most guests she was invisible, a blur of service, a hand offering a drink, a polite nod before fading again into the background. But within Amina, every moment of this night was sharp, every detail absorbed. She noticed the senator who laughed too loudly at his own joke, the CEO who kept glancing at his watch, the ambassador who kept his smile fixed even as his wife whispered scolding words in his ear. But she noticed, too, the way the wealthy looked at her. Or rather, the way they didn't. Their eyes slid past her as though she were part of the furniture, a fixture in the grand estate. If they looked at her at all, it was fleeting, casual, dismissive, until she spoke, which she rarely ever did. Amina had grown accustomed to silence. Back in her homeland, her grandmother had told her that silence was a shield. The less they notice you, the less they can take from you, she would say, pressing her wrinkled hands over Amina's. But her grandmother had also taught her something else, something no one in this ballroom could have imagined. Every night before the oil lamp, in a room where shadows danced across mud-brick walls, her grandmother had whispered to her in Arabic. She had taught her not only words but stories, poetry, and proverbs, the heartbeat of a culture carried through generations. Those lessons had been Amina's anchor, her inheritance, her unshakable truth. Now, far away from that small home and the desert winds outside it, Amina carried those words like hidden jewels inside her mind. But here, in this ballroom of power and polish, she kept them locked away. The music swelled, a full orchestra performing behind golden drapes. The notes of a waltz floated across the hall, inviting some guests onto the dance floor while others clustered in groups to exchange secrets dressed as pleasantries. Laughter rose, glasses clinked, and beneath it all, a tension hummed. It was the kind of tension that always existed when the powerful gathered. Ambition brushing against ambition, pride against pride, egos disguised as civility. John Everett sensed it. He had always been sensitive to the currents beneath the surface. He saw the way certain men puffed their chests when they spoke, the way women traded glances that carried more weight than words, the way deals were hinted at with the clink of champagne glasses. He knew tonight would bring more than just music and laughter. Something always happened at his galas. An alliance forged, a rival humiliated, a mask slipping at the wrong moment. And in that grand, glittering hall, Amina moved silently, tray in hand, eyes lowered yet alert. She had no place among these titans of industry and politics. Yet fate, which cares little for wealth or titles, had already chosen her for a role none of them could have predicted. For beneath the gold and laughter, beneath the chandeliers and polished marble, an invisible thread had already been drawn, linking the billionaire who saw everything with the maid who saw too much. That thread would soon tighten, and when it did, it would pull the entire room into silence. But for now, the evening played on. Music swirled, laughter rang, champagne sparkled, and the maid with ancient words in her heart moved quietly among them, unseen, unacknowledged, but waiting, though she did not yet know for what. The gala was in full motion now. Waiters floated through the room with trays of oysters and caviar. The orchestra's violins shimmered in the background, and clusters of politicians, business magnates, and socialites exchanged pleasantries wrapped in hidden agendas. John Everett stood at the center, surrounded by a ring of men and women who orbited him like planets around a sun. Some leaned in too close when they spoke, eager to secure his attention. Others kept their distance, knowing that to be seen listening was often as valuable as speaking. And then came the remark. It started innocently enough, or at least it was disguised that way. Senator Charles Warren, a portly man with a booming voice and a whiskey permanently clutched in his hand, decided to entertain the group. His cheeks were flushed, his tie slightly loosened, and his words slurred just enough to reveal that he had already enjoyed more than his share of champagne. "Ah, John," the senator said, chuckling as though the room itself were his audience. "I must say your staff is excellent tonight, though, between you and me, I sometimes wonder why we import so many of them." He gave a conspiratorial wink. "You'd think with all the money in this country we could at least find Americans to carry the drinks." A ripple of laughter spread through the circle. Not genuine laughter, but the uneasy kind, the laughter of people unwilling to challenge a man of influence, yet unwilling to fully endorse his words. Some smiled thinly, some glanced at their glasses, some shifted awkwardly. No one dared to openly disagree. John Everett's jaw tightened. He said nothing at first, but his silence carried weight. He had always despised careless arrogance, especially when it targeted those who had no voice in the room. To mock a maid or a waiter, a person unseen and unheard, was to reveal the smallest kind of man hiding inside the largest suit. But he did not speak in English. Instead, Everett slipped seamlessly into Arabic. His words were measured, each syllable precise, flowing from him with the fluency of someone who had not merely studied the language but lived it. "Respect is not shown by the size of your fortune, but by the dignity you afford to others. Who among you understands this?" The effect was immediate. Conversations faltered. Laughter froze in throats. Glasses hovered mid-air. Faces went blank with confusion. Arabic was not a language most of these guests had expected to hear tonight. They were men and women accustomed to negotiating in English, occasionally in French, perhaps Spanish, but Arabic? It was foreign to their ears, a riddle they could not solve. They looked at one another, searching for someone. Anyone who could respond. The ambassador from Egypt avoided eye contact, unwilling to be dragged into this confrontation. A CEO with a Middle Eastern oil partnership shuffled uncomfortably, but his knowledge of the language extended no further than a handful of pleasantries. The senator himself blinked, his smile faltering, his cheeks turning a deeper shade of red. The silence stretched. Guests shifted, cleared their throats, sipped their drinks as though the answers might be hidden at the bottom of their glasses. No one dared to admit their ignorance aloud, but the truth was obvious. In a room of the world's so-called elite, not a single one could reply. And then, from across the hall, a voice spoke. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, yet it carried with it a resonance that stilled the room. A young woman's voice, clear and measured, speaking in the same tongue Everett had used. Dignity is the crown that wealth cannot buy. Those who have lived without it know its worth. All eyes turned. There she stood, Amina, the maid with the tray of champagne still balanced in her hands. Her uniform was simple, her hair pulled back neatly, her posture modest. Yet, in that moment, she was no longer invisible. Her heart pounded so hard she feared the glasses on her tray would tremble and betray her nerves. She had not meant to speak, not truly. The words had escaped her before she could stop them. But how could she have remained silent when the language of her grandmother was being used not as ornament but as a test of truth? To stay quiet would have felt like erasing the very lessons that had shaped her. The silence that followed was unlike the silence after Everett's question. This one was heavy, electric, thick with disbelief. The guests stared at her as though she had grown wings. A maid answering the billionaire and in flawless Arabic? It was unthinkable. Everett's eyes locked onto hers. He was not shocked, not exactly. Surprised, yes, but beneath that surprise was something else. Recognition. He had lived long enough to know when he was hearing words born of wisdom, not arrogance. Slowly he nodded. The senator, on the other hand, looked as though someone had slapped him. His mouth opened, then closed again, his bluster evaporating in the face of a truth he could neither understand nor refute. The orchestra played on, oblivious to the storm that had passed through the hall, but the guests remained still, caught in the moment. The air seemed charged, as though the room itself had witnessed something sacred. Amina lowered her eyes, cheeks burning, wishing she could vanish back into the safety of anonymity. Yet something inside her felt strangely light, as though a weight she had carried silently had been set down at last. Everett broke the silence, his deep voice carrying across the hall. "There," he said, switching back to English, "is the only answer worth hearing tonight." His words struck like a hammer against stone, and the senator flinched. The guests shifted again, now looking at Amina with something closer to awe than dismissal. The maid who had been invisible was invisible no longer. The room was still buzzing from the moment that had just unfolded. Amina's voice lingered in the air like the final note of a song, impossible to forget. Guests whispered in low tones, some glancing at her with astonishment, others with disdain, but none with indifference. In a gathering where appearances mattered more than truth, she had done the unthinkable. She had spoken truth aloud. John Everett stepped forward. His polished shoes tapped lightly against the marble floor, yet the sound felt deafening in the silence. He was no longer smiling, no longer the genial host with a practiced charm. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, sharp, probing, never left Amina's face. She stood frozen, tray balanced in her trembling hands, unable to move. Every instinct screamed at her to lower her head, to apologize, to retreat back into invisibility. She was just a maid, a servant in a borrowed uniform. What right had she to answer a billionaire in front of senators and CEOs? But Everett's voice cut through her panic. "You're Arabic," he said, this time in English, his tone calm but commanding. "Where did you learn it?" The question was simple, but it was not casual. It was layered, heavy, demanding honesty. Amina swallowed hard. For a long moment, she considered remaining silent. But his eyes held her, steady and unyielding, and she realized she could not retreat without diminishing the words she had just spoken. She raised her chin slightly, her voice quiet but clear. "From my grandmother," she replied. "She taught me every night, by candlelight before I left home." Gasps rippled through the audience, not because of the content of her answer, but because of the way she said it. The cadence of her words carried a quiet dignity, the kind that comes not from wealth or education but from memory, from love, from struggle. Everett tilted his head slightly, as though weighing her. "And your home?" he asked softly. "Sudan," she whispered, her accent coloring the word. "A small village near the Nile. We had nothing, but my grandmother insisted language was wealth that could not be stolen." Her voice cracked on the last word. A rush of heat rose in her chest, threatening to overwhelm her, but she pressed her lips together and held it in. She had not meant to reveal so much, not here, not now. The room was utterly silent. Not a cough, not a shuffle of feet. Even the orchestra seemed to sense the tension, the music softening to a hum behind the velvet drapes. A senator's wife whispered something to her husband, her jeweled hand covering her mouth. A CEO frowned, as though calculating the implications of this revelation. The ambassador who had remained silent earlier now shifted uneasily, clearly embarrassed that the maid had spoken where he had not. Everett, however, was studying Amina with a gaze so intent it felt as though he could see through her skin to the memories underneath. And what he saw made him nod slightly, almost imperceptibly, as though confirming something only he understood. He turned slowly toward Senator Warren, the man whose careless remark had sparked this moment. The senator's cheeks were still flushed, his jaw tight. He tried to smile, but the effort twisted into a grimace. "Do you see?" Everett said, his voice low but edged with steel. "The most valuable voice in this room was one you nearly trampled without notice." The words landed like blows. A few guests looked down at their shoes. Others shifted their weight, uncomfortable with being witnesses to the humiliation. But there were also those whose eyes flickered with something else. Curiosity, perhaps even admiration. Not for the senator, but for the maid. Warren sputtered, attempting to recover. "Now see here, John. I meant no offense. It was a joke." Everett cut him off with a look so cold that the words died in the senator's throat. "Some jokes reveal the man who tells them," he said. "And some truths reveal the man who answers them." He turned back to Amina. Her tray was still in her hands, but her arms ached from holding it so long. Her breath came shallow, her heart pounding, yet she forced herself to remain steady. For reasons she could not explain, she felt as though shrinking away now would betray not only herself but her grandmother's memory. Everett stepped closer, his voice soft enough that only she, and those nearest, could hear. "You silenced this room," he said. "Not with power, not with wealth, but with truth." Her eyes widened, startled by his words. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, unsure what to say. Finally, she whispered, "I only spoke what I knew, and that," Everett replied, "is precisely why it mattered." Behind them, murmurs grew louder. Some guests were already spinning this moment into gossip, ready to retell it as a story of shock and scandal. Others watched with sharpened interest, wondering what Everett would do next. Would he punish her for speaking out, or elevate her? The uncertainty was almost unbearable. Amina wished she could melt back into the crowd, return to the safety of anonymity. But she also knew something had shifted irreversibly. Whatever happened next, she could never again be invisible. Not to Everett, not to the guests, not even to herself. And John Everett, a man who had built his empire by seeing what others missed, knew he had just uncovered something rare. In a room filled with rehearsed speeches and polished egos, the truest voice had come from the one person no one expected to hear. He let the weight of that realization settle over the room, then straightened his shoulders. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice regaining its command. "Remember this moment well. Tonight, we have been reminded that dignity does not come from title or fortune. It comes from truth, and from those who dare to speak it." Amina's chest tightened. She had not sought attention, but now she stood at the center of it. And though her instinct was still to retreat, some small flame inside her flickered with pride. The billionaire and the maid. 2 lives, 2 worlds, colliding in a single instant. And the shock of that collision was only just beginning to ripple outward. The air inside the ballroom felt different now. What had begun as a glittering gala of laughter, music, and champagne had shifted into something taut, electric, and uncertain. Guests who once floated effortlessly across the marble floor now stood in place, their eyes flicking nervously between John Everett and the young maid who had dared to speak. Amina had returned to her duties, or at least she tried to. She moved toward the corner of the hall, tray balanced in her hands, hoping to fade back into invisibility. But invisibility, she realized, was no longer possible. Whispers trailed in her wake. A senator's wife murmured to her husband behind a jeweled hand. A tech mogul leaned toward his associate, muttering under his breath while his eyes followed her. Even those who said nothing stole glances, their curiosity laid bare. She had not wanted this. She had spoken only because silence had felt unbearable. And yet, now the entire weight of the room pressed on her shoulders. Every step felt heavy, every movement scrutinized. But John Everett was not finished with her. Standing at the center of his circle of powerful guests, he raised a hand. Instantly, the orchestra softened to a faint hum, conversations died, and attention snapped back to him. He was a man used to commanding a room, but tonight, his command was shared, though few yet realized it, with the maid across the hall. "Amina," Everett said, his voice calm but carrying clearly across the room. Her breath caught. He had spoken her name. Not you there, not the maid, but her name. How had he known it? She realized with a jolt that of course he would know. Everett knew the names of everyone under his employ. He prided himself on it. Every head turned. Amina froze, her tray still balanced in her hands, the weight of crystal glasses suddenly unbearable. "Yes, sir?" she managed, her voice tight with restraint. "Would you step forward, please?" Gasps fluttered across the room. A maid summoned before the guests? It was unheard of. Servants were meant to remain unseen, unheard, blending into the background like furniture. Yet Everett's tone brooked no refusal. Slowly, carefully, she stepped forward, setting her tray on a passing waiter's hands before making her way across the marble. Each step echoed louder in her mind than the orchestra's strings. She could feel the eyes of the wealthy burning into her back, their judgments sharp, their curiosity sharper. When she stopped before him, Everett studied her with the same steady gaze as before. There was no mockery in his eyes, no condescension. Only interest and something deeper, something that felt almost protective. He turned to the crowd. "Tonight," he said, "we were reminded that wisdom and dignity are not bound to wealth or position. They are born of truth. And truth, when spoken, deserves to be heard." He paused, then switched back into Arabic. His voice flowed smoothly, each syllable measured, his accent precise. This language has carried poetry, philosophy, and history for over 1,000 years. Tonight it carried dignity. But I wonder, how many of you truly understood what was said? The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Those who had laughed at Senator Warren's joke now stared at the floor. Those who had boasted earlier of their global business connections looked away, exposed by their ignorance. Then Everett turned back to Amina. "Would you translate for me?" A silence followed, thick and sharp. Amina's stomach dropped. Translate? For him? For them? Her instinct screamed to refuse. She was no scholar, no diplomat. She was a maid. What if she stumbled? What if her voice shook? What if they laughed? But Everett's expression was steady, reassuring. He was not testing her. He was elevating her. She realized it in a rush. This was no trap. This was a gift. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, then nodded. "Yes, sir." Everett began to speak again in Arabic, his tone rising like a river carrying strength. He spoke of the importance of dignity in leadership, of the measure of a man being not his wealth but the respect he showed to those with less. He quoted a line of Arabic poetry, one that spoke of humility as the crown of the wise. The words rolled over Amina, familiar and resonant. She heard her grandmother's voice echoing in them. And when he paused, she lifted her chin and began to translate. Her English was clear, melodic, and unwavering. True strength is not measured in riches, nor in titles. It is measured in how we treat the smallest among us. Humility is not weakness. It is the crown of the wise. The crowd listened in rapt silence. There were no whispers now, no sideways glances. For the first time, they truly listened to her voice. Everett continued, his Arabic steady. Amina translated again, her words flowing with growing confidence. Each time, she felt the power shift in the room. No longer was she merely echoing Everett's message. She was shaping it, carrying it, giving it weight. By the time he finished, the silence that followed was different than before. It was not the silence of ignorance or awkwardness. It was the silence of respect. Amina lowered her gaze, her heart pounding, her cheeks flushed. She expected laughter, perhaps polite applause, maybe even dismissal. But instead, something remarkable happened. The guests, these titans of wealth and politics, applauded. Not thunderously, not like the roaring applause of a theater, but steadily, firmly, undeniably. Hands clapped across the hall, jewelry glittering under the chandeliers as the sound filled the space. Amina blinked, stunned. Applause? For her? Her knees trembled. She wanted to run, to hide, to cry. And yet, beneath the fear, a small flame burned warm, steady, undeniable. For the first time since leaving her homeland, she felt truly seen. Not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as a voice. Everett raised his hand again, and the applause quieted. His gaze swept the room, daring anyone to look away. "Remember this moment," he said firmly. "Tonight, it was not your wealth that silenced the room. It was not your power nor your titles. It was truth, and it came from where none of you looked for it." The words settled like stone. No one dared laugh. No one dared dismiss. And Amina, still standing at his side, realized that her life had changed. Whether for better or for worse, she did not yet know. But the shift had happened. The invisible wall between servant and master, between the voiceless and the powerful, had cracked. And there was no going back. When the last notes of the orchestra faded, and the final guests drifted out beneath the starlit sky, the grand ballroom of the Everett estate began to quiet. The glittering chandeliers still glowed, but the laughter, the gossip, the subtle clinking of glasses, all of it was gone. What remained was the echo of a moment that had shaken everyone present. Amina lingered in the shadows of the kitchen, her hands trembling as she stacked empty trays. She had shed the tray she carried earlier, but the weight of the night clung to her like a second skin. Her pulse had not yet slowed, and though her body moved on instinct, washing, wiping, tidying, the truth was she was still caught in the storm of what had happened. The applause still rang in her ears. The eyes of the crowd, heavy and piercing, still burned in her memory. And John Everett's words, "Remember this moment," still reverberated in her chest. She had not meant to change the night. She had not meant to draw the eyes of the most powerful men and women in the city. All she had done was speak the truth her grandmother had instilled in her since childhood. And yet, that truth had carried farther than she could have imagined. "Amina!" The voice startled her. She turned quickly to find John Everett standing in the doorway. He was no longer surrounded by admirers or sycophants. His jacket was unbuttoned, his bow tie loosened. Without the formal aura of the gala around him, he looked older, more human, but no less commanding. She froze, unsure whether she should bow, curtsy, apologize, or flee. Her instincts warred within her, but Everett spared her the confusion. He stepped forward, his expression softer than it had been all evening. "You silenced the room tonight," he said quietly. Her hands twisted nervously at her apron. I shouldn't have spoken, sir. It wasn't my place." Everett shook his head slowly. "And yet you spoke. And because of that, every man and woman in that room heard a truth they could not ignore." Her throat tightened. She looked away, afraid that if she met his gaze too long, she would lose control of the emotions brimming just beneath the surface. "I only said what my grandmother taught me," she whispered. "She believed that dignity is worth more than gold. She used to say, 'A man who loses wealth can earn it again. But a man who loses dignity, he has nothing left.'" Everett's eyes softened. He took a step closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Your grandmother was a wise woman. The words nearly undid her. For so long, her grandmother's teachings had felt like whispers from a past no one cared to remember. To hear them honored, acknowledged, seen by a man like Everett. It was almost too much to bear. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wanted me to study, Amina said quietly. To use my words, not just my hands. But after she passed, I had no choice. I had to come here, to work. Everett studied her for a long moment, and then he said something she never expected. Then let me give you that choice back. She blinked, confused. Sir, I will not see your talent wasted carrying trays, he said firmly. If you wish, I will sponsor your education. I will ensure you have the means to study, to build a life where your voice is heard. Amina's lips parted, but no words came. Her chest tightened, her breath catching in her throat. She had imagined many futures for herself, but never this. Not even in her most secret dreams. Her voice faltered. Why me? Everett's gaze was steady. Because truth is rare. Tonight I saw it in you. You did not speak to impress, or to gain favor. You spoke because silence would have been a betrayal. That courage is worth more than all the fortunes represented in that ballroom. Her eyes blurred with tears now, and this time, she did not try to stop them. They rolled freely down her cheeks, carrying with them the years of exhaustion, fear, and longing she had carried alone. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. Everett nodded, his expression still firm but softened by something she could not quite name. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. The thanks is mine. You reminded me tonight of something I had almost forgotten. She looked up, startled. What's that? That dignity, he said quietly, is the only wealth that matters when all else fades. For a long moment they stood in silence. The billionaire and the maid. Two lives so impossibly far apart, yet joined, if only briefly, by truth. Behind them, the staff continued their work, sweeping floors, clearing dishes, resetting tables. The night moved forward, as nights always do. But Amina knew that nothing would ever be the same. Not for her, not for John Everett, and perhaps not even for the guests who had witnessed what transpired. She did not know where Everett's promise would lead. She did not know if she dared to believe it fully. But for the first time since leaving her homeland, she felt the faint outline of a future that belonged not to circumstance, but to choice. And as she slipped quietly back into her work, her heart still racing, she knew one thing with certainty. Her grandmother's voice had not been silenced. It lived on in her words, in her courage, in the silence she had shattered. That night, in the grand halls of power and wealth, it had not been money, influence, or politics that defined the evening.